Gene editing is obviously the silver bullet we as farmers have all been grasping for. Finally, a simplistic, scientific and therefore obviously safe way to fix many, if not all, the issues we are facing in agriculture today. Issues related to drought and deluge, issues related to disease, issues related to pests. It's lucky we as humans are so smart because without our tremendous insight the world would have died out millennia ago. But hang on. That doesn't sound quite right, does it? The hubristic nature of humanity has been slowly eroding the natural capital of our planet for centuries, but with advanced veracity since the Industrial Revolution. Capitalism and consumerism became rife, and our society entirely abandoned living as part of the world, preferring instead to mine the earth for everything it has, crippling ecosystems for future generations. We are now the unlucky ones, living with the consequences of our forebears. Climate change, and of most importance, biodiversity loss. Our current global population of around 7 billion is expected to increase to 10 billion by 2050. This is a statistic driven by increased life expectancy rather than birth rates. And currently feeding our population is not actually an issue. That's not to say we don't have starvation, but that's an entirely different issue driven by logistics, food waste, war, and capitalist tendencies associated with food. But I'm going to focus on our agricultural issues for a start. Our job as farmers is to feed the world, except I really hate that phrase, since it's actually kind of pretty wishy-washy. Are we talking about calories or nutrition? Do we want a healthy population? Are we growing to ensure that governments are able to enact global trade, or to ensure that our local population is well nourished? The agricultural system in the UK and globally is broken. Less than 3% of farmed land in the UK is organic, which means that around 97% is already reliant on synthetically derived agrochemicals and fertilisers. What's more, much of this ag-chem no longer functions well, yet farmers are desperate to keep to what they know, their little silo, be it arable, dairy, beef, horticulture. Very few farmers mix their farms any longer, a practice that used to be intrinsic to agriculture and has only been possible due to those aforementioned synthetics. With ag-chem breaking down, we have two choices. Learn from our past mistakes and go back to mixed, localistic production, or enlist the help of science to breed our way out of our current predicament. One sounds like hard work, so it's no wonder that scientifically advanced breeding is being touted as a solution, one that enables some form of lifestyle farming. So I'm going to take a specific example within arable and a specific example within livestock. Arable. One of the biggest pests within cereal growing is barley yellow dwarf virus, a virus which is transported about by infected aphids, spread into cereal plants by those infected aphids feeding on the leaves. So, breeding an aphid-resistant crop is an obvious slam dunk. However, the mindset to get to that viewpoint is so simplistic and juvenile and harks to the hubris I discussed at the start. See, aphids may be symptomatic, but they are not causal. After all, speak to organic growers about BYDV, and they don't tend to have any issues. The question is not about the vectored virus at all. It is about why aphids choose to eat the crop. Why are they enticed? And the answer is to do with over-nitrification of the soils from continuous chemical arable farming. This over-nitrification makes the leaves a veritable feast of sugars for the aphid, and also means that cell walls in the plant are weak and not able to withstand the aphid's mouthparts. A double whammy of misfortune. Nitrification of the soil has a ton of other pollution effects also. Algal blooms in watercourses wreaking all kinds of havoc, for example. And breeding in aphid resistance to cereals doesn't fix that nitrification issue. It is just a band-aid solution, enabling this poor excuse for farming to persist. Now let's move to a livestock scenario, parasitic worms. There are tons of examples of resistance to anthelmintics within cattle and sheep. And worms within a herd have massive consequences to health and yield of that herd. So it would be super to be able to just instantaneously breed in worm resistance. Gene editing to the rescue once again. Better welfare for the herd or flock. Boom! But is it better welfare? Because isn't it actually poor welfare and husbandry causing these worm issues in the first place? Nature even has naturally anthelmintic plants in her arsenal. Sandfoin, birdsfoot trefoil, chicory, anyone. Naturally resistant animals would enable higher stocking rates, would continue the proliferance of set-stocked grazing systems. Resistance to wormers is itself actually an exciting tool to force change within the livestock industry to something that conforms with a more natural approach, e.g. mob grazing and diverse species lays, including those aforementioned anthelmintic plants. Now, I'm quite sure that my arable and livestock examples will have riled some of you listening, quite possibly because you believe me to be living my airy-fairy life in La La Land and not considering the people we have to feed. Yet that is the very antithesis of what I'm doing. You see, there is one thing busted and broken to an even greater extent than our farming system. Our food system is a disgrace, inefficient, imperialistic, wasteful, a logistical nightmare. Let's take bread as an example, the so-called staff of life, now regularly touted as a source of intolerance. Intolerances, I could argue, have only come to the fore since scientific meddling within wheat breeding and food manufacture. Most Group 1 bread-making wheat with 13+% protein goes into 800-gram loaves made with the Chorleywood bread-making process. A slurry of flour, additives, salt, sugar, water, and a bunch of other junk turned from raw flour to loaf within about 45 minutes. But let's roll back to the flour for a second. This is flour generated through steel roller milling, an exceptionally quick process that peels the bran and germ away from the wheat seed and mills the endosperm into a pure, white and thoroughly shelf-stable product. The bran and germ are where most of the inherent nutrition in the wheat resides. So, this nutritionally devoid flour is converted to a loaf in record quick time, in a method which leaves tons of live yeast in the resulting product and doesn't have any time to break down the inherent gluten. Is it a surprise that intolerances are on the rise? Essentially, this is a loaf which is calories only, a food product which will fill our bellies, give us raw energy, but barely nourishes us at all. How could this wheat be treated better then? For a start, let's concentrate on the flour. Slow, stone-milled flour grinds the entire wheat seed, endosperm, bran and germ. This can then be sifted to produce a more white flour if desired. But even in sifted form, the nutritious oils from the germ are still somewhat present, good for human health, but with the slight downside of producing a product which now does have a limited shelf life, around 3 months. Now let's take this flour and convert it to bread with the addition of only 2 ingredients, water and salt. No additives, no random extra stuff, and if we use a sourdough process, bread making will take 24 hours, sometimes even 48. And some really cool stuff happens with this naturally yeasted process. All the yeast ends up killing itself, and it entirely changes the gluten structure, making that gluten even more digestible. What's more, the sourdough process creates a bread which has 2 to 3 times the bioavailable nutrition of a supermarket Chorleywood loaf. I have heard that scientists are also looking to gene editing to change the gluten makeup of wheat to make it more digestible, presumably within the poor quality Chorleywood process. But my question would be, through that speedy breeding process, what else would you accidentally breed in? New intolerances that may take years to rear their heads? Quite possibly. This is just a single example of how broken our food system is. Look at other examples of continuously monocropped palm and corn, grown purely to be chemically broken down into ingrediential products such as corn syrup and palm oil. We have a food system that disregards the growing, massively over-processes, and in that over-processing strips out much of the nutrition, leaving us with high salt, high sugar, high calorie food which, whilst cheap at the point of consumption, is anything but when you figure in the NHS bill that creeps up years later. My point is that yes, we will have lower yields if we grow organically and naturally, but provided we treat the grown crop with respect as we convert it to food on the table, the nutrition grown with it will be there for us to consume too. Our world would be a much better place if we had a society that consumed 1,800 calories per day of nutrient-dense food, rather than 3,000 calories of nutrient-devoid rubbish. We might be skinny, but I bet there'd be a whole heap of other health and psychological benefits. I'll take a moment now to clarify, I am not anti-science, anything but science used incorrectly or omnipotently will only spell disaster. Last week, I was on a gene editing webinar with Dr. Michael Antonio, Head of Gene Expression and Therapy at King's College London. Someone who is considerably more qualified to talk about the actual process of gene editing itself than any farmer, or indeed the NFU, who have decided to come out in favour of gene editing and be reasonably dismissive of the risks. Michael's full 10-minute speech clarifying the risks of genome editing is available in full on YouTube, the link of which is available on A Bigger Conversations Twitter feed from the 2nd of March. But a few things really shone out to me. All those I've heard who are pro-GE speak about how amazingly precise and natural it is. It's scientific, and science is always a precise thing, right? But Dr. Michael clarified the exact opposite. Apparently, the place where the DNA is cut can be anything but precise, and there can be issues when the DNA heals with that newly added genetic material. Most shocking of all is that mutations can form away from the cut site, and how novel allergens or toxins can accidentally be bred into the plant or animal. So let's get this straight. People are arguing for a new scientific breeding method to be deregulated, allowing it unlabelled into food. Yet genetic modification mutations, including new toxins and allergens, may be present and potentially not detected. To me, that sounds a lot worse than risky, and in fact downright dangerous. One specific example Michael spoke of was an attempt in America to add a polled gene into horned cattle, such that progeny would be hornless. The gene insertion went great. Hornless cows, super! But when the full genome was examined, somehow antibiotic resistance had been conveyed to the cows along with that hornless gene. That sounds pretty frightening to me, but like I say, I am not the scientist. So instead, please take the time to hear it from the horse's mouth. Go and listen to Michael's talk on this. One of the most base arguments pro-GE within agriculture is the COVID vaccine. I have had it levelled at me countless times that since we use GE in medicine, it should be allowed within farming. But I don't see how two entirely different use cases can argue for each other. I mentioned earlier that we need to focus on fixing the root cause, not the symptoms. Much as though I was speaking about agriculture, is the same not true for health? Heart disease, diabetes and cancer can often be diet related. So we should surely do something about the food system that drives those issues. Back to COVID. Whilst the genuine cause of the outbreak of this pandemic may not yet have been categorically determined, it is very likely to have been via the wet market or animal conditions similar to it. Now we have the pandemic, am I pleased that gene editing techniques have enabled a swift rollout of a vaccine? Yes, of course I am. But if we don't change our practices to stop that same causation, it is only a matter of time before the next pandemic strikes, and we will have to enact gene editing once again for vaccines, except there will still be a ton of unnecessary deaths before that new vaccine is ready. It seems to me that the justification for gene editing is that we as humans have decided to live on top of the world rather than integrated within it. We like to enact our arrogant will however we see fit. Whilst playing around with genes may allow us to do that for a few more years, it is patently clear that the world is dying because of our decisions. I can't imagine any farmer is a climate change denier, and biodiversity collapse is being so widely reported on that disputing it would be quite simply idiotic. So, we have to change. Change, not stay doing the same old thing. We have to relearn how to live with our planet, to nurture and nourish it, as we should also be nurturing and nourishing ourselves. Gene editing is persistence, not change, and should form no part of our farming system moving forward.